Let's talk about the people who make a lot of money. Not the lottery winners, not the trust fund recipients, not the people who happen to be the third employee at a company that got acquired for $1 billion because they were standing in the right place at the right time holding the right cup of coffee. Those people exist, and good for them, but their story is not particularly instructive for the rest of us because the primary variable in their outcome was luck. And luck is not a skill you can develop through deliberate practice. The people this video is about are the ones who made a lot of money on purpose, the ones who set out to build significant wealth and did it, not once through a single lucky break, but repeatedly, consistently across different industries, different economic environments, different starting points, the entrepreneurs who built companies from nothing, the investors who compounded capital over decades, the executives who climbed to the top of their fields and commanded compensation that made their colleagues' eyes water, the professionals who turned specialized expertise into income that most people would consider absurd for the underlying activity. What do these people have in common? That's the question this video is going to answer. And the answer is not what most people expect, because most people, when they imagine the psychology of high earners, picture one of two caricatures. The first caricature is the ruthless, sociopathic, sleep-when-you're-dead grinder who sacrificed everything human about themselves at the altar of money and success. The second caricature is the effortless genius who found their passion, followed it relentlessly, and watched the money arrive as a natural consequence of doing what they loved. Both caricatures contain fragments of truth. Both are substantially wrong, as general descriptions of how high earners actually think and operate. The reality is simultaneously more nuanced, more specific, and more practically applicable than either story suggests. The people who make a lot of money on purpose share a specific set of psychological characteristics, patterns of thinking, perceiving, deciding, and behaving that are distinct from the patterns of people who earn comfortably but not extraordinarily. These characteristics are not genetic gifts that you either have or don't. They are, with varying degrees of difficulty depending on starting point, learnable. They are also, importantly, distinct from the personality traits that popular culture most associates with financial success: the aggressiveness, the confidence, the extroversion, which turn out to be much less predictive of actual wealth accumulation than the less glamorous psychological features this video will describe. Some of what you're about to hear will be familiar from other sources, described in ways that finally make it click. Some of it will genuinely surprise you. At least one thing will make you uncomfortable in the specific way that accurate self-assessment tends to produce discomfort. And by the end, you'll have a clear, specific, psychologically grounded picture of what actually separates the people who build extraordinary wealth from the people who understand wealth building intellectually without quite getting there. Let's meet the psychology. Chapter 1. The Relationship with Time. How high earners experience the clock completely differently. Here's the first and most foundational psychological difference between people who make a lot of money and people who don't, and it's one that almost never appears in the financial success content that dominates YouTube because it sounds too abstract to be actionable until you understand the specific ways it manifests in daily decisions. High earners experience time differently, not as a philosophical matter, as a practical, behavioral, decision-making reality that shapes dozens of choices per day in ways that compound into dramatically different financial outcomes over years and decades. The future self is real, not hypothetical. Here's the specific cognitive feature that underlies the time perception difference. People who build significant wealth have a vivid, concrete, emotionally real relationship with their future selves that most people don't have. Behavioral economists have documented extensively that most people treat their future selves as strangers, as people they feel relatively little emotional connection to, whose welfare they weight less heavily than their present self's comfort and pleasure. The research is striking. In brain imaging studies, people's neural responses to thinking about their future selves more closely resemble their responses to thinking about strangers than to thinking about their current selves. We are, neurologically, somewhat indifferent to the person we will become. This indifference is the psychological foundation of every financial decision that feels rational in the present and looks catastrophic in retrospect. The purchase that depletes the savings account feels fine because the future self who needed that savings account feels abstract and distant. The investment that gets skipped because the present is enjoyable feels fine, because the future self who would have benefited from compound growth for 30 years feels like someone else's problem. High earners, the people who build genuine, substantial wealth, consistently report and demonstrate a fundamentally different relationship with their future selves. The future self is vivid. It is motivating. It is, in an emotionally meaningful sense, real. The decision to invest rather than spend doesn't feel like deprivation for a stranger who may or may not benefit someday. It feels like taking care of someone they care about, who happens to also be them just later. This psychological difference is not primarily a matter of willpower or self-discipline, though those traits play a role. It's a matter of mental representation, how vivid and emotionally connected the future self is in the decision-making moment. The person who has done the work of making their future self real, through specific visualization, through writing about future goals in concrete detail, through regular financial planning that makes the future tangible, makes different decisions than the person whose future self is a vague abstraction. The opportunity cost obsession. Here's the specific behavioral manifestation of the time perception difference that high earners describe most consistently. An almost automatic, near involuntary calculation of opportunity cost that runs in the background of every significant decision. Opportunity cost, the value of the next best alternative foregone by a choice, is something that economics textbooks introduce and that most people understand conceptually without ever actually calculating in real-time decision-making. The person who spends $50,000 on a luxury car that could have been a $25,000 functional vehicle has made a $25,000 choice, but what most people don't viscerally experience is the opportunity cost of that $25,000, the $200,000 it would have been worth in 20 years invested at 7% return. People who make a lot of money run this calculation automatically, not because they're joyless, not because they never spend money on things they enjoy, but because the automatic calculation informs which things they choose to spend on. The opportunity cost is part of the price tag. A $25,000 discretionary purchase is not a $25,000 decision. It's a $200,000 decision over a 20-year horizon, and the person for whom that calculation is automatic, rather than theoretical, makes the decision differently than the person for whom only the sticker price is real. This doesn't produce paralysis or miserliness in high earners. It produces intentionality, a consistent preference for spending on things that generate lasting value, lasting experiences, or lasting relationships over things that provide brief pleasure and then sit depreciating in a garage or closet. The psychological experience of spending is different when the opportunity cost is real rather than theoretical. The long game is default setting. Here's the third manifestation of the time perception difference: the automatic orientation toward long-term outcomes in environments that reward short-term thinking. The modern economy is saturated with incentives for short-term thinking: quarterly earnings reports, social media engagement metrics, the instant feedback loop of consumer spending. Buy now, feel good immediately. The entire structure of most employment, which rewards the work completed today more than the investment and capability that will generate value in 3 years. People who build significant wealth have, through some combination of natural disposition and cultivated habit, developed an orientation toward the long game that operates even in environments that don't reward it. They make decisions that optimize for outcomes measured in years rather than in weeks, even when the short-term cost of that orientation is visible and the long-term benefit is still abstract. The specific psychological mechanism that enables this is what psychologists call delayed gratification capacity, the ability to tolerate present discomfort or foregone pleasure for future reward. The famous marshmallow test was an early and imperfect study of this capacity, but the underlying psychological trait it was attempting to measure is real and significant. People with higher delayed gratification capacity consistently make more financially productive decisions across the full range of wealth-building behaviors: investing, education, career development, business building, because they're more willing to accept the present tense cost of decisions whose payoff is future tense. The good news, genuinely good news, not motivational poster nonsense, is that delayed gratification capacity is not a fixed trait determined at age 4 by whether you ate the marshmallow. It is significantly influenced by context, by the specific mental strategies the person uses to make future rewards feel more real, and by the track record of past decisions that builds or erodes confidence in the payoff of patience. It can be cultivated. Chapter 2. The specific relationship with risk. Not fearless, just calibrated differently. Here's the psychological feature of high earners that popular culture most consistently misrepresents: their relationship with risk. The common narrative is that successful people are bold risk takers who bet big, embrace uncertainty, and thrive on the adrenaline of high-stakes decisions. This narrative is seductive, widely believed, and significantly wrong as a description of how most people who accumulate genuine wealth actually think about and manage risk. Risk tolerance is not the variable. Risk calibration is. Here's the specific distinction that separates the accurate description of high-earner risk psychology from the popular mythology. Successful wealth builders are not characterized by high risk tolerance, the willingness to accept large losses for large potential gains. They are characterized by superior risk calibration, the ability to accurately assess the actual probability and magnitude of different outcomes, which leads them to take risks that look bold from the outside but feel calculated from the inside. The average person overestimates some risks and underestimates others in systematic and well-documented ways. They overestimate the risk of dramatic, memorable, emotionally salient failures, the business that collapses spectacularly, the investment that goes to zero, and underestimate the risk of the slow, invisible, emotionally neutral failures. Career that never advances because the difficult conversation was perpetually avoided, the investment return foregone because the market decline felt too scary to stay through. People who build significant wealth have, through experience, education, or some combination, developed more accurate risk assessments across the range of situations they encounter. They are not braver than average. They are more accurate. The risks they take that look bold to observers feel calculated to them because they've done the analysis that the observer hasn't done and arrived at a genuinely different probability estimate for the outcomes. The entrepreneur who leaves a stable job to start a company is not, in their own psychological experience, making a heroic leap of faith. They've analyzed the market, validated the product concept, built a financial runway that covers the failure scenario, and concluded that the expected value of the decision is positive. The boldness is in the external description of the decision. The internal experience is more like solving a math problem that came out in favor of proceeding. Asymmetric risk, the specific type of risk. High earners love. Here's the specific risk structure that people who make a lot of money seek out and optimize for: asymmetric risk. Situations where the potential upside is large and the potential downside is limited and defined. The classic asymmetric risk structure is the early stage investment or startup equity. The maximum loss is the amount invested, while the potential gain is many multiples of that amount. The asymmetry, large upside, capped downside, means that a portfolio of such bets generates a positive expected value even with a majority of losses, as long as the wins are large enough to more than compensate for the losses. High earners are not characterized by making more bets than average people. They are characterized by being much more selective about the structure of the bets they make, consistently preferring situations with asymmetric upside over situations with symmetric or negatively asymmetric payoffs. The salaried employee who works overtime without additional compensation is accepting a negatively asymmetric payoff: unlimited downside in time and energy, capped upside in additional income. The same person who uses that time to build a side income with unlimited upside is accepting an asymmetric structure. The application of this principle goes far beyond financial investments. Career decisions, relationship decisions, skill development decisions. The people who build wealth consistently structure their major decisions to preserve optionality on the upside while limiting the downside, which is the behavioral manifestation of asymmetric risk preference. The calculated bet psychology: how high earners think before acting. Here's the specific mental process that high earners describe when making significant decisions, which is sufficiently different from how most people approach the same decisions that it deserves explicit description. Most people making a major decision spend the majority of their cognitive energy evaluating the upside scenario, imagining the positive outcome, feeling the appeal of the goal, generating enthusiasm for the direction. The downside is acknowledged briefly and then emotionally suppressed because dwelling on it feels pessimistic and undermines motivation. People who build significant wealth spend disproportionate cognitive energy on the downside first. They ask, what is the worst realistic outcome of this decision? How probable is it? How bad would it actually be? Can I recover from it? How long would recovery take? If the answer to these questions produces a downside that is survivable, one that, even in the worst realistic case, doesn't permanently compromise their financial position, health, or core relationships, they proceed with relative confidence. If the answer produces a downside that is catastrophic and potentially unrecoverable, they decline or restructure the decision to limit the downside before proceeding. This is the psychological approach that Warren Buffett's maxim, rule number 1, never lose money, rule number 2, never forget rule number 1, is actually describing. Not the literal impossibility of avoiding all investment losses, but the specific cognitive priority of evaluating the downside first and refusing decisions where the downside is catastrophic relative to the upside. The practical result of this decision framework: high earners rarely experience the truly catastrophic outcomes that periodically destroy otherwise successful people's financial positions. Not because they're luckier, but because they've pre-filtered the decisions that could produce those outcomes and declined to make them. The failure relationship, not resilience but reframing. Here's the psychological feature of high earners' risk relationship. That is most commonly described as resilience, but is more accurately described as reframing, the specific way they process and use failure rather than merely surviving it. The popular description of successful people's relationship with failure: they're resilient, they bounce back, they don't let setbacks define them, is accurate as far as it goes, but misses the specific psychological mechanism that makes this possible. It's not primarily emotional toughness, though that helps. It's a cognitive reframe of what failure means that is genuinely different from how most people experience it. For most people, significant failure, a business that didn't work, an investment that lost money, a career move that didn't pan out, is primarily an emotional event whose primary meaning is, I am someone who fails. The failure becomes identity threatening, which is what produces the avoidance behaviors, the reluctance to try, the preference for certain modest outcomes over uncertain, potentially large ones, that limit wealth accumulation. For people who build significant wealth, failure is primarily informational. It is data about what doesn't work, which is useful precisely because it narrows the field of what might work, and because the attempt itself generated skills, relationships, and knowledge that have value independent of the outcome. The failure is not evidence about what they are, it's evidence about what a specific approach in a specific context produced, which is different. This reframe is not simply telling yourself positive things about failure to feel better. It's a genuine shift in the cognitive frame through which failure is processed, and it produces real behavioral differences, specifically the willingness to make more attempts in more varied directions with more genuine commitment that are statistically likely to produce a successful outcome eventually, because more attempts at positive expected value bets increases the probability of a hit. Chapter 3. The income versus wealth distinction, the psychological line that most people never cross. Here's the chapter that addresses what is arguably the most important single psychological distinction between people who earn a lot and people who actually accumulate wealth, a distinction that is frequently described in financial literature, but rarely examined at the psychological level where it actually operates. The income versus wealth distinction, specifically the psychological shift from optimizing for income, the flow of money, to optimizing for wealth, the stock of assets. This shift, which sounds like a simple conceptual reframe, is in practice one of the most psychologically significant transitions in the financial lives of people who ultimately build substantial net worth. And it's a transition that many high-income earners never make, which is why the category of high earner, low net worth is far larger than most people. Realize. The doctor problem, high income, surprising fragility. Here's the specific demographic that illustrates the income versus wealth distinction most starkly: physicians. Doctors in the United States are among the highest income earners in the economy. Median physician compensation exceeds $300,000 annually, and specialists routinely earn $500,000 to $1 million or more. By most people's intuition, a physician who has been practicing for 20 years should be extraordinarily wealthy. Many are not. The specific pattern, documented extensively in personal finance literature and described ruefully by financial planners who work with physician clients, is the physician who has earned $400,000 per year for 15 years, has a total net worth of $800,000, and is genuinely uncertain whether they could stop working for a year without significant financial stress. The math of this outcome requires explanation. $400,000 times 15 years is $6 million in gross income. After taxes, approximately $4 million in take-home pay. $800,000 in net worth means approximately $3,200,000 was spent rather than invested. Over 15 years. On what? On the lifestyle that $400,000 per year is culturally expected to produce, in the social environments that physicians inhabit, the house in the right neighborhood, the private school tuition, the cars that signal professional success, the vacations that match the peer group's standard, the restaurant meals, the club memberships, the second home. Each individual expense is reasonable. The aggregate is devastating to wealth accumulation. The physician's psychological relationship with money is organized around income, around the flow. The income is large and it feels like wealth. The income is reliable and it feels like security. The income is socially visible and it provides the status signals that the peer group is generating through consumption. But income is not wealth. Income stops when the physician stops working, whether by choice, by health crisis, by disability, or by the industry, changes that no career is permanently immune to. Wealth continues generating income when the person stops. The physician with $800,000 in net worth after 15 years of high income has optimized for income and the lifestyle it enables. The physician with $3 million in net worth after the same period has optimized for wealth. The psychological shift. When the optimization target changes. Here's what the shift from income optimization to wealth optimization looks like at the psychological level. The actual internal change that produces different financial decisions rather than just the outcomes those decisions create. Income optimization is psychologically organized around consumption capacity, what can I afford, and social comparison, what does someone at my income level have? The reference point for decisions is the peer group's consumption standard, and the emotional driver is the discomfort of being seen to consume below that standard. Wealth optimization is psychologically organized around asset accumulation and the passive income those assets generate. What am I building? An independence. How long could I sustain my lifestyle without working? The reference point for decisions is the personal financial goal, and the emotional driver is the specific satisfaction of watching the asset base grow. The shift between these two orientations is not primarily about information. Most high-income earners who remain in income optimization mode know perfectly well that they should be saving more and investing more. The knowledge is present. The behavior doesn't follow. This is the specific feature of the income versus wealth distinction that makes it psychological rather than informational. The behavior follows the emotional orientation, not the intellectual knowledge. The shift in emotional orientation, from deriving satisfaction primarily from consumption capacity to deriving satisfaction primarily from asset accumulation, is what produces the behavioral change. And this shift is triggered, in the lives of people who make it, by a specific psychological event rather than by financial education alone. The triggering event. What actually changes the optimization target? Here's what the research on financial behavior change and what the personal histories of wealth builders consistently show. The shift from income optimization to wealth optimization is almost always triggered by a specific visceral experience rather than by gradual intellectual persuasion. The trigger is different for different people. For some, It's a sudden income disruption, a job loss, a medical issue, a business that unexpectedly contracted, that revealed the fragility of a financial position built entirely on income flow rather than asset stock. The experience of having the income interrupted and discovering that the lifestyle it supported couldn't be maintained for more than a few months without it is a jarring psychological event that permanently changes the emotional valence of asset accumulation. For others, the trigger is witnessing a specific contrast, a close observation of someone whose income is modest, but whose financial security is extraordinary because their assets generate passive income that covers their expenses. The person who earns $80,000 per year but has built a $2 million investment portfolio generating $80,000 annually is financially free in a way that the person earning $400,000 per year with no significant asset base is not. And observing this contrast up close can produce the specific reframe that financial education alone often doesn't. For others still, it's a calculation, often triggered by a financial planning conversation or a moment of honest self-assessment, that makes the current trajectory's endpoint specific and alarming enough to change the emotional relationship with saving and investing. Knowing abstractly that you should save more is different from calculating specifically that your current trajectory produces retirement at 73 with a portfolio that runs out at 82 and experiencing the emotional weight of that specific picture. Whatever the specific trigger, the shift it produces is real and durable in a way that intellectual persuasion typically isn't, because it has changed the emotional relationship with wealth accumulation, not just the cognitive understanding of it. The stealth wealth psychology, what it looks like. From the outside, here's the behavioral manifestation of the wealth optimization mindset that is most counterintuitive to outside observers. The people who have accumulated the most significant wealth are frequently the least visibly wealthy. The research on this pattern is extensive and consistent. The high-income earner in the expensive car and the impressive house is statistically less likely to be wealthy than the moderate-income person driving a 10-year-old sedan and living in a house that is clearly within their income range. The consumption signals of wealth, the visible expenditures on status items, and the actual accumulation of wealth are negatively correlated in the broader population because the same dollar can be consumed or invested, but not both. People who have made the psychological shift to wealth optimization experience consumption differently than income optimizers. The status signals of consumption, the car, the watch, the neighborhood, have lower emotional value for them because their status reference group has shifted from consumption peers to asset peers. They are not comparing their car to their colleague's car. They are comparing their net worth trajectory to their financial independence target, and the car comparison is simply less emotionally relevant. This is not asceticism or self-denial. It is a genuine shift in what provides satisfaction. From the consumption of resources to the accumulation of resources, that makes the behavioral difference feel less like sacrifice and more like preference. The wealth optimizer who drives a modest car is not white-knuckling through the temptation of the luxury vehicle. They genuinely don't particularly want the luxury vehicle because the $50,000 difference in price is emotionally real to them as an asset rather than as a consumption option foregone. The specific habits of the wealth optimization mindset. Here's the practical behavioral fingerprint of the person who has made the psychological shift to wealth optimization. The specific habits and practices that emerge from the shift in emotional orientation. They track net worth regularly, monthly or quarterly, rather than tracking income and spending. Net worth is the metric that the optimization target is organized around, so it's the metric they monitor. The income statement matters as an input to the net worth trajectory, but the balance sheet is the scorecard. They think in terms of assets that generate income rather than in terms of spending capacity. Every major financial decision is evaluated in terms of its impact on the asset base. Does this decision increase assets, decrease them, or convert one form of assets to another? The question, can I afford this, is replaced by, what does this do to my financial independence timeline? They have a specific number, a financial independence number, a retirement number, a specific target net worth, that their decisions are calibrated toward. The number makes the optimization target concrete rather than abstract, which sustains the emotional connection to the goal across the hundreds of small decisions that collectively determine the outcome They are genuinely comfortable with delayed gratification at a scale that income optimizers find uncomfortable, because the future self who benefits from the patience is emotionally real and motivating rather than abstract and distant. Chapter 4: The Attention Economy: How High Earners Manage Their Most Valuable Resource. Here's the chapter that addresses the resource that high earners protect more fiercely than money, more deliberately than their physical health, and more strategically than their professional relationships, and that most people treat as an infinitely renewable resource that can be freely distributed to whoever demands it most loudly. Attention. Specifically, the quality, direction, and duration of focused cognitive effort that gets applied to the problems and opportunities that determine financial outcomes. The connection between attention management and wealth accumulation is not metaphorical, it is causal and specific. The decisions that most determine financial outcomes, the business strategy, the investment thesis, the career pivot, the skill development investment, require sustained, high-quality cognitive effort that is only available when attention is protected from the constant fragmentation that the modern environment systematically produces. The person whose attention is perpetually fragmented across notifications, obligations, other people's priorities, and the ambient anxiety of a maximally stimulating information environment is not capable of the sustained, deep thinking that the most financially consequential decisions require, regardless of their raw intelligence or the quality of the opportunities available to them. The Attention Portfolio: How High Earners Think About Where Cognitive Energy Goes. Here's the specific mental model that characterizes how people who build significant wealth think about their attention, a model that is sufficiently different from how most people think about it that naming it explicitly is useful. Most people experience their attention as something that is allocated reactively. It goes where the most urgent, most emotionally compelling, or most socially insistent demand is, in the order those demands arrive. The inbox that fills, the notifications that appear, the colleague who stops by the desk, the news cycle that provides an infinite supply of emotionally activating content. These are the practical directors of most people's attention throughout most of their waking hours. People who build significant wealth experience their attention as a portfolio, a finite, valuable resource that is proactively allocated to the activities that generate the highest return rather than reactively distributed to the activities that generate the most immediate pressure. They start from the question, what is the highest value use of my cognitive effort today, and protect the time and mental space required for that activity from the reactive demands that would otherwise fill it. The practical manifestation of this difference is what Cal Newport calls deep work, the ability to perform cognitively demanding tasks in a state of distraction-free concentration for extended periods. This capacity is both increasingly rare. The attention fragmentation of the modern environment makes it harder to sustain, and increasingly valuable, because the most financially rewarding work in the modern economy is disproportionately the work that requires it. The person who can think clearly about a complex problem for 3 uninterrupted hours produces qualitatively different output than the person who thinks about the same problem in 15-minute fragments between interruptions, even if the total time is identical. High earners have, through discipline or deliberate system design, protected their access to the former, while most people live primarily in the latter. The no infrastructure: How high earners protect attention at scale. Here's the specific behavioral practice of attention management that high earners describe most consistently and that most people find most difficult to implement: the systematic, unapologetic, sometimes socially costly practice of saying no to demands on their time and attention that don't align with their highest value activities. The average person experiences the decision to decline a request, to say no to a meeting, to decline an invitation, to not respond to a message, to refuse a commitment, as a social cost that requires significant justification. The default is yes, and departing from the default requires overcoming the social discomfort of declining, which most people experience as significant enough to override their rational assessment of whether the commitment is worth making. People who build significant wealth have recalibrated this default. Their default is no, or more precisely, their default is a rigorous evaluation of whether the specific demand is worth the attention it would consume before agreeing to it. The social discomfort of declining has been weighed against the cost of accepting commitments that fragment attention and consume time that would otherwise be available for high-value work, and the balance has been struck more aggressively in favor of protecting attention. This is not rudeness or social indifference. The most effective high earners are often extraordinarily generous with their attention when they've decided the investment is worthwhile. But the decision of whether it's worthwhile is made deliberately rather than by default, and the bar for worthwhile is higher than most people set it, because the opportunity cost of attention is more viscerally understood. The practical system that many high earners build around this principle, batched communication rather than continuous availability. Email answered in 2 specific windows per day rather than continuously. Phone on, do not disturb during protected work periods. Calendar managed by the owner's priorities rather than by whoever requests time first. Meetings accepted only when the specific value of the meeting has been identified and is worth the time cost. The information diet: what high earners consume and what they don't. Here's the attention management practice that has the most direct impact on the quality of thinking that high earners can sustain. The deliberate management of information input, specifically the consistent prioritization of deep, high-quality information sources over the broad, shallow, emotionally activating information that the modern media environment defaults to providing. The news consumption habits of people who build significant wealth are strikingly different from average. They consume significantly less daily news, particularly breaking news, political commentary, and social media content, and significantly more books, long-form analysis, industry research, and direct conversation with domain experts. The distinction is not about being uninformed, it's about the signal-to-noise ratio of different information sources relative to the decisions that matter for financial outcomes. Breaking news has a very low signal-to-noise ratio for financial decision-making. The volume is high, the emotional activation is high, and the proportion of content that is actually relevant to the decisions that determine financial outcomes is very low. The person who spends 2 hours per day consuming news is generating significant cognitive load and emotional activation from content that produces minimal decision-relevant insight. Long-form books, industry research, and conversations with genuine domain experts have very high signal-to-noise ratios. The volume is lower, the emotional activation is lower, and the proportion of content that is relevant to consequential decisions is much higher. The person who spends 2 hours per day reading books in their domain of expertise or having conversations with people who have specific relevant knowledge is generating decision-relevant insight that compounds over years into a significant informational advantage. The compounding aspect of the information diet difference is what makes it financially significant over time. The person who reads 50 substantive books per year for 10 years has developed a knowledge base that is qualitatively different from the person who has consumed an equivalent number of hours of social media and news. The quality of the decisions those two knowledge bases support is different in ways that produce different financial outcomes, not through any single dramatic decision, but through the accumulated effect of hundreds of better calibrated, smaller decisions. The energy management dimension. Here's the aspect of the attention management picture that extends beyond time and focus to the physical and physiological, the degree to which high earners treat physical energy as a direct input to cognitive performance, and therefore as a financial asset worth managing. The connection between physical health practices and sustained high cognitive performance is well documented in the research and consistently reflected in the habits of people who maintain high levels of productive output over decades. Sleep quality, exercise consistency, nutrition, and stress management all affect the quality and quantity of cognitive output in ways that are directly relevant to the financial decisions that depend on that output. High earners, particularly those who sustain high performance over long periods rather than burning out in spectacular early success, are disproportionately consistent in the basic physical health practices that support cognitive function, not because they're health fanatics, but because they've made the connection between physical state and cognitive quality explicit enough that maintaining the practices feels like maintaining a productive asset rather than a personal indulgence. The specific practices vary by individual, but the consistency of prioritization is the common feature. The high earner who treats sleep as negotiable, who regularly sacrifices it for additional work hours, is running down a cognitive asset that will eventually extract a performance cost. The high earner who treats exercise as a luxury to be scheduled around work is accepting a permanent reduction in the physical energy that supports cognitive performance. The people who sustain exceptional performance over decades are almost universally people who've built the basic physical maintenance practices into their lives with the same non-negotiability they'd apply to a critical business function. Chapter 5. The Network Psychology. How high earners build and use relationships differently. Here's the chapter that addresses the social dimension of wealth accumulation, the specific way that people who make a lot of money build, maintain, and use professional and personal relationships, which is sufficiently different from how most people approach relationships that it deserves careful examination rather than the usual generic advice about the importance of networking. The generic networking advice, go to events, exchange cards, follow up, build your network, misses the specific psychological features of how high earners actually relate to people. It describes the mechanics without capturing the orientation, the quality, or the specific relational practices that produce the outcomes. The value creation orientation, giving before taking. Here's the foundational psychological feature of high earners' relationship approach that is most consistently described by the people who've built significant networks and most consistently missed by the people trying to replicate the outcomes without the underlying orientation. Genuine, proactive, non-transactional value creation for others. The popular conception of the strategic networker is the person who cultivates relationships with an eye toward what those relationships can eventually produce. The favor that can be called in, the introduction that can be requested, the opportunity that the relationship makes accessible. This transactional orientation is common, visible, and recognizable to everyone who has been on the receiving end of it. The person who reaches out only when they need something, whose attention is calibrated to your usefulness rather than to you as a person. People who build the most valuable and durable professional networks operate from a fundamentally different orientation. They lead with value creation, consistently and genuinely, without explicit expectation of reciprocal benefit. They share information that might be useful. They make introductions that serve both parties. They provide access to their knowledge, their network, or their platform to people who can benefit from it. They do this not as a calculated investment strategy, though it is, functionally, an extraordinarily effective one, but as an expression of a genuine orientation toward creating value in interactions with people they find interesting or respect. The psychological mechanism that makes this orientation financially powerful over time is what Robert Cialdini's research identifies as the reciprocity principle, the deeply ingrained human tendency to want to return value received, combined with the social capital accumulation that genuine value creation produces. The person who has consistently created value for their network has, over time, built an enormous store of goodwill and reciprocal obligation that becomes available in the form of opportunities, introductions, information, and support that the transactional networker's contacts are not motivated to provide. The relationship investment model. Here's the specific practice that distinguishes high earners' relationship management from the average professional's approach, treating key relationships as long-term investments that require consistent, intentional maintenance rather than intermittent transactional contact. Most people's professional relationship maintenance pattern is reactive and occasion-driven. They reach out when they need something, when a life event provides a natural touch point, or when an algorithm reminds them that it's been a while. The relationship exists in a largely dormant state between these occasional activations, and the depth of the relationship reflects the limited investment that this pattern produces. High earners who build genuinely valuable professional networks maintain key relationships with the consistency and intentionality of a long-term investment. They schedule regular contact, coffee every quarter, a check-in call every month, a thoughtful email when they see something relevant to the other person's interests. They remember and follow up on important details, the project the person mentioned, the family situation they shared, the goal they described. They invest in the relationship during the periods when they don't need anything from it, which is the specific practice that makes the relationship genuinely deep rather than superficially maintained. The financial return on this investment is not immediate or guaranteed for any specific relationship. It is a portfolio return. The aggregate outcome of a large number of consistently maintained relationships is a network that generates opportunities, information, support, and access, at a rate that the reactive, transactional networker's contacts simply don't produce. The mentorship psychology: why high earners seek it and how they use it. Here's the specific relationship type that appears most consistently in the professional histories of people who build significant wealth and that most people underinvest in dramatically: mentorship and sponsorship relationships with people significantly further along in the relevant domain. The psychological resistance to seeking mentorship is well documented and worth naming. It requires acknowledging that someone else has knowledge, perspective, and experience that you lack, which activates the ego protection mechanisms that make vulnerability uncomfortable. It requires asking for something, time, attention, guidance, from someone whose time is valuable, which activates the social discomfort of potentially being declined. And it requires accepting feedback and direction that may be critical, which most people find easier to say they welcome than to actually receive. High earners, particularly in the earlier stages of their careers and wealth accumulation, are distinguished by the degree to which they override these resistances and actively seek out the guidance of people whose outcomes they want to learn from. They ask for mentorship explicitly, rather than hoping it will materialize organically. They prepare for mentorship conversations with specific questions and specific context that make the mentor's time as valuable as possible. They implement the guidance they receive and report back, which is the behavior that converts a one-time conversation into an ongoing relationship, because mentors invest more deeply in people who visibly act on the guidance. The specific financial value of a well-chosen mentor cannot be precisely calculated, but can be directionally understood. A mentor who has navigated the terrain you're entering has made the mistakes that are available to make and learn from them. Access to that knowledge, the specific mistakes to avoid, the specific opportunities to prioritize, the specific people worth knowing, has an enormous expected value relative to the investment of time and vulnerability required to access it. The peer group effect, the most underrated wealth variable. Here's the relationship psychology insight that is simultaneously the most well-known. You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with has been repeated enough that it's practically a cliché, and the most consistently underestimated in its actual behavioral impact. The peer group's consumption standards, ambition levels, and financial norms have a direct and significant effect on individual financial behavior. The mechanism is not mysterious. Humans are deeply social animals whose sense of what is normal, what is acceptable, and what constitutes adequate achievement is calibrated primarily by their reference group. The person whose peer group normalizes high savings rates, business ownership, and wealth accumulation experiences these behaviors as normal and expected. The person whose peer group normalizes high consumption, lifestyle inflation, and income spending experiences the same behaviors as abnormal and slightly incomprehensible. People who build significant wealth are distinguished by 2 specific practices related to peer groups. First, they are unusually deliberate about the composition of their peer group. They actively seek out relationships with people who are further along in their financial and professional development, which continuously raises the reference standard rather than allowing it to be determined by whoever is geographically proximate. Second, they are more willing than average to let relationships that pull toward lower standards naturally diminish in priority, not through dramatic rejection, but through the simple reallocation of time and attention toward relationships that are more aligned with their goals. The social cost of this practice is real. The peer group adjustment involves some degree of social friction, some relationships that atrophy, some environments that become less comfortable as the gap between personal standards and group norms widens. The financial benefit is the continuous recalibration of what feels normal, which shapes behavior in ways that compound over decades into dramatically different financial outcomes. Chapter 6: The Self-Concept of High Earners, the internal story that makes everything else possible. Here's the chapter that gets to the deepest level of the psychological picture, the layer beneath the habits, beneath the risk calibration, beneath the attention management, and the relationship strategy. The specific beliefs that high earners hold about themselves, about money, and about their relationship to outcomes that make all the other psychological features functional rather than aspirational. Because here's the thing about all the psychological characteristics described in the previous chapters: they are behaviors, and behaviors follow beliefs. The person who doesn't believe at some level that their attention is worth protecting won't protect it regardless of what they know about deep work. The person who doesn't believe that wealth accumulation is genuinely available to them won't make the sacrifices that accumulation requires. The person who holds specific limiting beliefs about money, beliefs absorbed from their family of origin, their cultural environment, or their specific experiences with financial failure, and will find those beliefs reasserting themselves at the decision points that most determine financial outcomes. The identity-income connection. You don't earn more than you believe you're worth. Here's the psychological phenomenon that every financial therapist, every high-performance coach, and every person who has watched intelligent, capable people chronically underperform their potential has observed. There is a ceiling on income that is set not by market forces, not by skills, not by opportunity availability, but by the individual's internal sense of what they deserve and what is consistent with who they are. The specific mechanism, when income begins approaching the internal ceiling, when earnings or net worth reach the level that unconsciously feels like too much for someone like me, specific, identifiable behaviors emerge that prevent the ceiling from being broken. The business owner who chronically underprices their services despite market evidence that higher prices would be accepted and sustained. The executive who sabotages a promotion opportunity through behavior that is difficult to explain by any external logic. The investor who sells positions that are working and doubles down on positions that aren't, in a pattern that consistently produces outcomes below what the portfolio's quality should generate. These behaviors are not random. They are the behavioral expression of an internal identity that has not expanded to accommodate the higher level of financial success, and they reliably produce the outcomes that the identity says are appropriate regardless of the external opportunity available. People who build significant wealth have, through some combination of innate disposition, specific experiences, or deliberate psychological work, developed an identity that is expansive enough to accommodate extraordinary financial success without triggering the self-sabotage mechanisms that identity-income misalignment produces. This doesn't mean they are arrogant or entitled. Those are different things entirely. It means they have genuinely internalized the belief that their success is legitimate, that the value they create justifies the compensation they receive, and that continued growth is consistent with who they are rather than a departure from it. The money beliefs audit. The specific limiting beliefs that cost the most. Here's the specific category of psychological work that produces the highest financial return for people whose earnings are constrained by identity and belief rather than by skill or opportunity: the identification and deliberate revision of limiting beliefs about money. The most common and most financially costly limiting beliefs, the ones that appear most consistently in the psychological histories of people who chronically underperform their potential, fall into several recognizable categories. The scarcity belief, the deep, often unconscious conviction that money is fundamentally limited, that wealth accumulated by one person comes at the expense of others, that there isn't enough for everyone to succeed, that wanting more than one currently has is greedy or presumptuous. This belief, typically absorbed from family environments where money was discussed in scarcity terms, produces a guilt response to financial success that limits the psychological comfort with accumulation. The worthiness belief, the specific conviction that high financial compensation is appropriate for certain types of people, people with the right credentials, the right background, the right level of confidence, but not for oneself. This belief produces the chronic underpricing of services, the reluctance to negotiate compensation, and the discomfort with charging what the market would genuinely bear that limits earnings below their potential ceiling. The moral belief, the conviction that wealth and moral virtue are in tension, that rich people are greedy, that money corrupts character, that the pursuit of significant wealth is incompatible with being a good person. This belief, absorbed from cultural and religious environments that treat wealth accumulation with suspicion, produces a consistent conflict between financial ambition and identity that is resolved unconsciously by limiting financial ambition. The association belief, the specific association of financial success with characteristics the person finds unappealing, the ruthlessness, the workaholism, the social disconnection that popular culture attributes to high earners, which produces an unconscious resistance to success because success means becoming someone they don't want to be. Each of these beliefs, when present, produces specific behavioral patterns that are visible in financial outcomes without the individual necessarily being aware of the underlying belief structure. The audit of these beliefs, the deliberate examination of what one actually believes about money, wealth, and one's own financial potential, is the psychological work that produces behavioral change at the identity level rather than the habit level, which is where durable change actually lives. The growth identity, the specific self-concept that wealth requires. Here's the specific self-concept feature that appears most consistently in the psychological profiles of high earners, and that is most directly actionable as a target for deliberate development: the growth identity. The growth identity is the genuine, internalized belief that capabilities, knowledge, and outcomes are primarily determined by effort, strategy, and learning, rather than by fixed, innate qualities. What Carol Dweck's research describes as the growth mindset, but at the identity level rather than the belief level. The person with a growth identity doesn't just believe intellectually that growth is possible. They experience themselves as someone who is continuously developing, whose current capabilities are a starting point rather than a ceiling, whose current outcomes are inputs to a learning process rather than evidence about their fixed potential. The financial implications of the growth identity are specific and significant. It produces the investment in skill development, the willingness to spend time and money becoming more capable, that generates the most reliable long-term income growth. It produces the persistence through failure that high-risk, high-return activities require. It produces the intellectual humility that allows high earners to continuously update their models and strategies as new information becomes available, which is the cognitive flexibility that distinguishes the people who adapt and thrive through changing conditions from the people who defended positions that were working until they weren't. The growth identity is also specifically what makes the learning from mentors, from books, from experiences both positive and negative actually available for integration rather than threatening. The person who experiences their intelligence as fixed and their capabilities as defined is threatened by evidence that they don't know something or haven't thought of something. The person who experiences themselves as continuously developing welcomes exactly that evidence, because it's the input that enables the next round of growth. The specific narrative high earners tell about themselves. Here's the practical manifestation of the identity dimension in the daily psychological experience of high earners. The specific internal narrative they maintain about who they are and what they're doing. The internal narrative, the ongoing story each person tells themselves about their life, their choices, and their direction, is not simply a reflection of external reality. It is a partial creator of it because the narrative shapes the decisions that produce the outcomes that confirm or disconfirm the narrative. The person whose internal narrative is, "I am building something significant and the current challenges are part of that process," makes different decisions than the person whose internal narrative is, "I am struggling and I don't know if it's going to work out." Even when the objective external circumstances are identical, high earners consistently maintain a narrative that combines specific ambition, a clear sense of what they're building and why it matters, with genuine equanimity about the timeline and the specific difficulties encountered along the way. They are not blandly optimistic. Many of them are quite clear-eyed about risks and challenges. But the narrative frame within which those risks and challenges are held is one of engaged problem-solving rather than existential threat. The specific narrative feature that most distinguishes high earners from their peers. They narrate themselves as agents, as people whose decisions and efforts are the primary determinants of their outcomes, rather than as recipients of circumstances. The locus of control is internal, not in the naive sense of believing they control everything. Most high earners have a sophisticated understanding of the role of luck, timing, and circumstance, but in the specific sense that the primary variable they focus on, narrate around, and put their energy into is the one they actually control: their own actions, decisions, and development. This internal locus of control narrative is the psychological foundation of the initiative taking, the persistence, the continuous improvement investment, and the ownership of outcomes that characterize the behavioral profile of high earners, because if your outcomes are primarily determined by your actions, then improving your actions is the obvious priority, and the energy that might otherwise go into explaining why circumstances are unfavorable goes instead into changing the circumstances. Chapter 7: The Decision-Making Architecture. How High Earners Make Better Choices. Faster. Here's the chapter that addresses the specific cognitive infrastructure that high earners have built around the activity that most determines financial outcomes: making decisions. Not the quality of any single decision, though that matters, but the systematic approach to decision-making that produces better average outcomes across the hundreds of consequential choices that accumulate into a financial life. The popular framing of decision-making in the context of success, trust your gut, make bold choices, decide quickly, and adjust, contains enough truth to be convincing and enough incompleteness to be dangerous. High earners don't simply make bolder decisions or faster ones. They make decisions through a specific architecture, a set of mental processes, habits, and systems that reduces the influence of cognitive biases, increases the quality of the information feeding the decision, and separates the decisions that deserve extensive deliberation from the ones that can and should be made quickly. The decision categorization system. Here's the specific practice that the most effective decision makers documented extensively in everything from Jeff Bezos' shareholder letters to the academic literature on expert decision making, used to allocate cognitive effort appropriately across different types of decisions, categorizing decisions by reversibility and consequence before deciding how much time and energy to invest in them. The framework is simple and powerful. Decisions that are reversible and low consequence, the vast majority of daily decisions, should be made quickly with minimal deliberation, because the cost of a wrong decision is low, and the cost of excessive deliberation is the time and cognitive energy that could be applied to higher value activities. Decisions that are irreversible or high consequence deserve extensive deliberation, information gathering, and the full range of analytical tools that produce better outcomes. Most people apply the wrong level of deliberation to both categories. They agonize over reversible, low-consequence decisions: which restaurant to go to, which version of a product to buy, which of two comparable options to choose, consuming cognitive energy that produces negligible outcome improvement, and they under-deliberate on irreversible, high-consequence decisions: the career move, the business commitment, the major investment, because the urgency of the moment, the social pressure to decide, or the discomfort of extended uncertainty pushes them toward faster resolution than the decision's importance warrants. High earners who have built this categorization into their decision-making default have effectively automated a resource allocation that most people make haphazardly, and the compound effect of applying the right level of deliberation to each decision category over years is a significantly better average decision quality across the full portfolio of choices. The pre-mortem practice: thinking forward from failure. Here's the specific decision-making tool that behavioral economists and experienced investors consistently identify as one of the most effective techniques for improving decision quality, and that most people have never systematically applied: the pre-mortem. The pre-mortem, a technique developed by psychologist Gary Klein, reverses the standard decision analysis process. Instead of asking, "What could go wrong with this decision?" from the perspective of the present, it asks, "Imagine we are 12 months in the future, and this decision has failed badly. What happened?" The psychological shift from hypothetical future failure to imagined past failure is subtle, but produces dramatically different analytical output. The problem with standard risk analysis, what could go wrong, is that it's susceptible to optimism bias, motivated reasoning, and the emotional investment in the decision that typically exists by the time the analysis is being done. The person who wants the decision to work out unconsciously downweights the failure scenarios that the analysis surfaces. The pre-mortem bypasses this dynamic by starting from the assumption of failure and working backward. Given that the decision failed, what was the cause? This framing activates a different cognitive mode, one that is more willing to surface the specific vulnerabilities, the assumptions that might not hold, the dependencies that might fail. because the exercise isn't defending the decision against failure scenarios, but explaining a failure that has already hypothetically occurred. High earners who use this tool consistently report that it surfaces specific, actionable concerns that the standard analysis missed, concerns that can then be addressed before commitment rather than discovered after it. The quality of decisions made after a thorough pre-mortem is measurably better than decisions made without one. Not because the pre-mortem prevents all failure, but because it prevents the specific category of avoidable failures that optimism bias and motivated reasoning would otherwise allow through. The Advice Network, consulting the right people in the right way. Here's the decision-making practice that high earners use more consistently and more skillfully than most people, and that has a specific structure that the generic advice to seek input from others doesn't capture: the deliberate construction and consultation of a personal advisory network organized around specific domains of expertise. Most people seeking input on a major decision consult whoever is most accessible and most emotionally supportive, typically close friends and family who are genuinely invested in the person's well-being, but who often lack the specific domain knowledge to provide decision-relevant insight. The input received is warm, supportive, and frequently unhelpful as a guide to the actual decision, because the advisors are optimizing for the person's emotional comfort rather than for decision quality. High earners seeking input on major decisions consult people with specific, relevant, and ideally hard-won expertise in the domain of the decision, and they consult those people in a way that is specifically designed to elicit critical assessment rather than supportive validation. They describe the decision they're considering, including the specific concerns they have about it and the assumptions it rests on, rather than presenting it in its most favorable light and inviting reaction. They explicitly ask for the strongest case against the decision. They ask what they're missing. They ask what the person would do differently. This consultation style produces qualitatively different input than the standard "what do you think of this idea?" approach, because it signals to the advisor that critical assessment is genuinely welcomed, which licenses the advisor to share concerns they would otherwise soften or suppress to avoid seeming unsupportive. The Decision Journal, learning from every outcome. Here's the practice that distinguishes high earners who improve their decision-making over time from those who make the same calibration errors repeatedly: systematic decision tracking and review. The human memory for past decisions is deeply unreliable in a specific and financially costly direction. It tends to reconstruct past decisions in ways that make the actual outcome seem more predictable than it was. After a decision works out, the memory reconstructs the decision as obviously correct. After a decision fails, the memory reconstructs it as having contained obvious warning signs that should have been heeded. This hindsight bias prevents genuine learning from decision outcomes because the memory doesn't preserve the uncertainty that existed at the time of the decision, the raw material that accurate calibration requires. A decision journal, a written record of significant decisions, including the reasoning behind them, the alternatives considered, the specific uncertainties acknowledged at the time, and the expected outcomes, preserves the pre-outcome state of knowledge that hindsight bias would otherwise reconstruct. When outcomes are reviewed against this record, the learning is genuine rather than retrospective rationalization. The investor can see which analytical assumptions held and which didn't. The entrepreneur can see which market judgments were accurate and which were wishful thinking. The professional can see which bets on career moves produced the expected returns and which didn't. The compound effect of this systematic learning, updating decision frameworks based on actual tracked outcomes rather than reconstructed memories, is a continuous improvement in decision calibration that most people's informal learning processes don't produce. The high earner who has maintained a decision journal for 5 years is making systematically better calibrated decisions than they were at year one in a way that the person relying on memory alone typically isn't. Chapter 8. The Work Ethic Myth: What High Earners Actually Optimize For. Here's the chapter that challenges the most pervasive and most misleading narrative about how high earners achieve their outcomes: the work ethic story, the hustle culture mythology, the idea that the primary variable separating extraordinary financial outcomes from ordinary ones is the number of hours worked and the intensity of the effort applied. This narrative is wrong, not completely wrong. Effort matters, and people who build significant wealth typically work very hard during key periods of their financial development. But effort is far down the list of differentiating variables, and the specific way High earners think about and direct their effort is dramatically different from what the hustle narrative describes. Hours versus output. The productivity confusion. Here's the specific confusion that the hustle narrative perpetuates and that costs people who buy into it both financially and personally: the conflation of hours worked with valuable output produced. Hours are an input. Output, the specific results that generate financial value, is what actually matters. The relationship between hours and output is not linear, is not consistent across different types of work, and is dramatically affected by the specific conditions under which the hours are worked. 2 hours of focused, high-quality cognitive effort on the highest leverage activity in the business generates more financial output than 10 hours of fragmented, distracted work on activities that feel productive without generating proportional value. High earners are distinguished not by working more hours than average, though some do, but by generating more valuable output per hour through the specific combination of focus, prioritization, and leverage that makes each hour produce more than average. The entrepreneur who works 60 hours per week but directs 40 of those hours toward high leverage activities, business development, product strategy, key relationship management, generates more financial output than the entrepreneur who works 80 hours per week with the same 40 hours of high leverage work buried in 40 hours of administrative tasks, low priority meetings, and activities that feel busy without generating proportional value. The leverage obsession: how high earners multiply their effort. Here's the specific productivity orientation that characterizes high earners more than work volume: the relentless pursuit of leverage, the multiplication of effort through systems, technology, delegation, and capital that makes each unit of personal effort produce more output than it would in unleveraged form. The 4 primary forms of leverage that high earners deliberately build into their professional and financial lives are worth describing specifically because the deliberateness of the building is what distinguishes high earners from people who stumble into leverage accidentally. Labor leverage, building teams and organizations that multiply the output of the owner's direction and judgment, is the first and most powerful form of leverage for most business builders. The entrepreneur who can only generate value through their personal effort is capped at the output a single person can produce. The entrepreneur who has built a team that amplifies their judgment and direction can generate the output of 10, 50, or 100 people through the leverage of organizational structure. Every hire that is more skilled in their specific domain than the owner could be is leverage, the owner's judgment directed through someone whose execution capability exceeds the owner's in that specific area. Capital leverage, deploying financial capital to generate returns that exceed the cost of that capital, is the fundamental mechanism of investing and of business scaling through external financing. The investor who deploys $1 million to generate a 15% annual return is earning $150,000 per year from the capital's work rather than from personal effort. The business builder who raises growth capital to scale a proven business model is deploying other people's capital to generate returns that exceed the cost of that capital, with the difference accruing to equity. Technology leverage, using software, automation, and digital infrastructure to produce outputs that previously required proportional human effort, has become the most accessible form of leverage in the current era and is disproportionately exploited by high earners who are consistently earlier than average to identify and deploy productivity multiplying technology. Media and distribution leverage, building a platform, an audience, or a distribution channel that allows ideas, products, or services to reach many people at minimal marginal cost per additional recipient, is the leverage that has produced some of the largest and most rapid wealth accumulations of the current era. The creator with a large audience, the company with a strong brand, the platform with network effects. These are examples of distribution leverage that generates enormous output from a single creative or commercial effort. High earners build leverage deliberately because they understand that personal effort is finite and that the financial ceiling on unleveraged personal effort is relatively low, regardless of how hard that effort is applied. The wealth-building opportunity is in building the leverage structures that multiply whatever personal effort is applied. The energy management over time management. Here's the specific reframe that the most effective high earners apply to the question of how to generate more output. A reframe that is more consistent with the actual relationship between human performance and output than the standard time management framing. Time management, the allocation of fixed 24-hour days to specific activities, is the conventional framework for thinking about productivity. It treats all hours as equivalent and focuses on filling them with high-priority activities. This framework is useful but incomplete because it ignores the variable that most affects the output generated per hour, the quality of cognitive and physical energy available during those hours. The same hour worked in a state of high cognitive energy, focused, rested, motivated, physically well, produces dramatically more valuable output than the same hour worked in a state of depleted cognitive energy. Distracted, tired, stressed, physically depleted, the person who manages their energy as carefully as their time, protecting the conditions that produce peak cognitive performance, scheduling the highest leverage activities during peak energy periods, and structuring rest and recovery as seriously as work, generates more output in fewer total hours than the person who maximizes time on task without regard for the energy state in which that time is spent. High earners are disproportionately people who have either intuitively or deliberately made this shift from time management to energy management, and whose work structures reflect it. The protected morning hours where the most cognitively demanding work happens before the day's interruptions begin. The exercise that is non-negotiable because the cognitive performance it enables is worth more than the hour it consumes. The deliberate recovery practices that allow sustained high performance over decades rather than the burning sprint followed by collapse that the hustle narrative celebrates. The skill stack psychology, how high earners think about capability development. Here's the specific intellectual framework for career and capability development that characterizes high earners and that differs from how most people think about professional skills. The skill stack approach. Most people think about professional skill development in terms of depth, becoming as specialized and expert as possible in a single domain, which provides competitive advantage through genuine scarcity of that specific expertise. This approach is sound and produces good outcomes in specific professional contexts, where depth is the primary value driver. High earners who have built exceptional income trajectories often think about skills differently, in terms of unique combinations rather than pure depth. The specific combination of skills that each individual accumulates, even when no single skill is at the top of the global distribution, can produce an unusually valuable profile if the combination is rare and if the skills complement each other in ways that generate more value in combination than any single skill would alone. The writer who also deeply understands a specific technical domain is more valuable than either a pure writer or a pure technical expert in contexts where both capabilities are needed. The business developer who genuinely understands technology is more effective in technology businesses than the pure business developer without that understanding. The investor who has operational experience running businesses sees investment opportunities and risks that the pure financial analyst misses. High earners are often people who have deliberately accumulated skill combinations that are rare, who invested in the second and third skills that complemented the first, rather than simply deepening the first to its maximum extent. The deliberateness of this accumulation, guided by an understanding of which skill combinations the market values and which are undersupplied, produces professional profiles that command compensation premiums that pure depth in any single domain might not. Chapter 9. The Dark Side, the Psychological Costs That Nobody Talks About. Here's the chapter that every honest video about the psychology of high earners requires and that most content in this space conspicuously omits: the specific psychological costs, the shadow side, the features of the high earner psychology that produce the outcomes described in the previous chapters while simultaneously creating specific challenges, vulnerabilities, and human costs that deserve acknowledgement rather than glossing over. Because here's the thing, the psychological profile that produces exceptional financial outcomes is not simply a list of admirable traits that happen to generate wealth. It is a specific configuration of psychological features, including some that are genuinely costly in dimensions that money doesn't measure. And presenting the profile honestly requires describing the full picture. The relationship cost of high achievement orientation. Here's the first and most commonly experienced psychological cost of the high earner profile. The specific tension between the achievement orientation that drives financial success and the relational presence that sustains meaningful personal relationships. The person whose attention is carefully managed for maximum cognitive output, whose social calendar is filtered through a productivity lens, whose emotional energy is substantially directed toward professional goals, is a more effective professional and a less fully present partner, parent, and friend than the person whose attention, social energy, and emotional availability are more freely distributed. This is not a character flaw. It is a trade-off, one that many high earners make consciously and one that many make without fully accounting for the cost until the cost has accumulated into relationship damage that money cannot address. The partner who has watched their high-achieving spouse treat family time as a recovery period between work sprints rather than as a genuine priority. The children who experience their high-achieving parent as physically present but mentally absent. The friendships that atrophied because the investment required to maintain them was consistently displaced by professional demands. The specific psychological feature that makes this cost most insidious, the same identity-level commitment to achievement that drives financial success, makes it genuinely difficult to be fully present in contexts that don't advance the goal. The dinner conversation that isn't about anything consequential, the child's activity that doesn't develop any particular skill, the social obligation that produces connection without productivity. These experiences feel like costs rather than investments to the achievement-oriented person, which makes genuine presence in them difficult, and the relationship consequences of that difficulty easy to rationalize as temporary rather than cumulative. The high earners who navigate this tension most successfully are the ones who have deliberately extended their definition of achievement to include relationship quality, who have made the specific connection between the health of their most important relationships and the sustainability of everything else they're building. Not as a productivity calculation, but as a genuine values reorientation that makes presence in non-productive contexts feel like achievement rather than sacrifice. The arrival fallacy, the happiness that doesn't arrive when the number does. Here's the specific psychological phenomenon that virtually every high earner who has been candid about their experience describes, and that the financial success narrative almost universally omits: the arrival fallacy. The arrival fallacy, a term popularized by positive psychologist Tal Ben-Shahar, is the specific disappointment that follows achieving a goal that was supposed to produce lasting happiness or satisfaction, but produces instead a brief surge of positive feeling followed by a return to baseline, and then the immediate identification of the next goal that will finally produce the lasting satisfaction the last one didn't. The specific financial manifestation. The person who was certain that reaching $1 million net worth would feel definitively different, only to find that it felt like any other Tuesday. The person who achieved the income target they'd been working toward for a decade and discovered that the relief was temporary and the satisfaction was genuine but brief. The entrepreneur who sold the company for the number they'd always cited as success and found themselves restless and purposeless within months. This is not a universal experience. Some high earners describe genuine and sustained satisfaction with financial achievements, but it is common enough to be worth explicitly addressing because the pursuit of financial goals whose achievement is expected to produce lasting happiness generates a specific kind of psychological suffering, the perpetual deferral of satisfaction to the next milestone, that is particularly acute in people with high achievement orientation. The specific psychological work that addresses this pattern, developing the capacity for present moment satisfaction alongside future orientation, rather than treating present satisfaction as something to defer until the goal is achieved. The high earner who can find genuine enjoyment in the process of building, in the daily work, the small wins, the relationships formed along the way, is not vulnerable to the arrival fallacy in the same way as the person who has located all meaningful satisfaction in the future achievement. The identity fragility of outcome-based self-worth. Here's the psychological vulnerability that the achievement orientation creates when the self-concept is too tightly bound to financial outcomes. The specific fragility that follows from locating self-worth in results rather than in character, effort, or values. The person who experiences themselves as valuable primarily because of their financial achievements has a self-concept that is entirely dependent on continued financial success. Every setback, the quarter where revenue missed, the investment that lost money, the business initiative that failed, is not just a bad business outcome. It is a threat to the identity, The emotional response to failure is disproportionate to the actual business consequence because it carries the additional weight of threatening the self-concept. This dynamic produces specific behavioral distortions. It makes high earners who are experiencing financial difficulty less likely to be honest about that difficulty with advisors, with partners, with themselves, because the admission of struggle feels like an admission about their fundamental worth rather than about a specific situational challenge. It produces the denial and concealment that converts manageable financial problems into catastrophic ones by preventing early intervention, and it produces the specific brittleness, the inability to adapt gracefully to changing circumstances that distinguishes the high earner who collapses when their formula stops working from the one who adapts and rebuilds. The psychological protection against this fragility, a self-concept grounded in something more stable than financial outcomes, the values that guide behavior regardless of results, the character qualities that persist through success and failure, the relationships that are genuinely unconditional. High earners who have built their identity on these foundations use financial success as evidence of their values and efforts rather than as the foundation of their worth, which makes setbacks informational rather than identity-threatening. The comparison trap at high levels. Here's the specific psychological dynamic that surprises many people who achieve significant financial success. The comparison trap doesn't disappear as income and wealth increase. It changes reference group. The person earning $50,000 per year compares themselves to peers earning $100,000 and feels inadequate. The person earning $500,000 per year compares themselves to peers earning $2 million and feels inadequate. The person with a $10 million net worth moves in circles where $10 million is the entry point and compares themselves to people with $100 million. The emotional experience of relative deprivation, the sense of having less than the relevant reference group, is available at every level of the wealth distribution because the reference group automatically adjusts to include the people just above the current position. High earners who are most psychologically healthy around money are the ones who have made the specific decision to measure financial well-being against an internal standard, the personal financial independence target, the level at which genuine security is achieved, rather than against the peer group's wealth level. This internal reference point is stable in a way that the peer group reference point isn't, because the peer group's wealth level rises with the individual's, ensuring that the comparison-based inadequacy is perpetually available regardless of the absolute level achieved. Chapter 10. The Synthesis. Putting the psychology into practice. Here's the chapter that takes everything in the previous 9 chapters and asks the most important question. Given this portrait of how high earners think and operate, what specifically can someone do to develop these psychological features deliberately rather than waiting to acquire them through the decades of experience that most high earners describe as their teacher? The answer requires honesty about 2 things simultaneously. First, that these psychological features are genuinely developable. They are not fixed traits that some people have and others don't, but patterns that can be cultivated through specific practices. Second, that the development is neither instant nor frictionless. It requires sustained effort, specific discomfort, and the willingness to engage with the internal material that most personal development advice would prefer to skip. The starting point, the honest self-assessment. Here's the first and most important practice in the development of the high earner psychology. The honest, systematic self-assessment of which psychological features are already present in some form, which are genuinely absent, and which are present but expressed in ways that currently work against financial outcomes. The assessment is not comfortable. It requires applying to oneself the same clear-eyed analysis that the chapters above described high earners applying to business decisions. The questions. Worth sitting with. How vivid and motivating is my relationship with my future self? How accurately do I assess risk? And in which direction do I systematically err? Am I optimizing for income or for wealth? And does my behavior match the answer I give? How well do I protect my attention from the demands that fragment it? What does my peer group normalize about money and financial ambition? What do I actually believe about my own financial potential? And where did those beliefs come from? The answers that emerge from this assessment, the honest ones, not the aspirational ones, are the starting point for the specific development work that moves the psychology toward the high earner profile. The beliefs that need examining, the habits that need building, the relationships that need investment or recalibration, the identity narrative that needs expanding, the belief work, the highest leverage starting point. Here's the specific development priority that produces the most leverage for most people whose financial outcomes are constrained by psychology rather than by opportunity or skill: the identification and deliberate revision of the limiting money beliefs described in Chapter 6. The specific practice: write down every belief you hold about money, wealth, rich people, and your own financial potential, without filtering for what you think you should believe. Include the beliefs that feel embarrassing or contradictory. Include the ones you absorb from your parents without ever consciously choosing them. Include the ones that your rational mind disagrees with, but that your behavior seems to reflect. Then examine each belief against the evidence. Is the scarcity belief actually true? Is wealth accumulation zero-sum? Or does the evidence of history suggest that wealth creation is net positive? Is the worthiness belief actually about your specific limitations? Or is it a generalized cultural script that you've accepted as personal truth? Is the moral belief supported by your actual observations of wealthy people you know and respect? Or is it a caricature derived from news coverage and entertainment? The examination doesn't automatically revise the belief, but it makes the belief visible as a belief rather than as fact, which is the necessary precondition for choosing a different belief. And the choice of different beliefs, sustained through deliberate practice and evidence collection, gradually shifts the emotional orientation that produces the behavioral differences that produce the financial outcomes. The environmental design strategy. Here's the development practice that produces the most reliable behavioral change across the full range of psychological features described in this video, designing the environment to make the desired behaviors automatic, rather than relying on willpower to sustain them against environmental resistance. The peer group adjustment, deliberately seeking out relationships with people whose financial orientation, ambition level, and money norms more closely reflect the target psychology, is the most powerful single environmental design decision available. It changes what feels normal, what gets celebrated, what conversations happen and don't happen, in ways that reshape behavior more powerfully and more durably than any amount of internal motivation. The information environment adjustment, reducing the consumption of content that activates the comparison trap, the scarcity beliefs, and the short-term orientation, and increasing the consumption of content that reinforces the long-term perspective, the growth identity, and the wealth optimization mindset, shapes the daily cognitive inputs that partly determine the daily financial decisions. The physical workspace design, creating environments where deep work is possible, where distraction is physically minimized, where the cues that trigger productive behavior are present and the cues that trigger distraction are absent, makes the attention management practices described in Chapter 4 easier to sustain consistently. The financial system design, automating savings, investment contributions, and the financial behaviors that the income optimizer in most people would otherwise override in the moment, builds the wealth optimization behaviors into the infrastructure rather than leaving them dependent on moment-to-moment willpower. The practice sequence. Where to start? Here's the specific sequence for someone who has internalized the psychological portrait this video has described and wants to develop it deliberately, ordered by leverage rather than by ease. Start with the belief audit. The beliefs are the foundation. Behaviors built on unexamined limiting beliefs are fragile. They erode under pressure back toward the beliefs that underlie them. Beliefs revised through honest examination and deliberate replacement are the foundation on which durable, behavioral change can be built. Then address the peer group. The environment is more powerful than willpower in the long run, and the peer group is the most powerful element of the environment. This doesn't require dramatic social disruption. It requires gradually increasing the investment in relationships that reinforce the target psychology while reducing the investment in relationships that work against it. Then build the attention management infrastructure, the protected work time, the communication batching, the news diet adjustment, the physical health practices that support cognitive quality. These are the systems that make the high-leverage behaviors available consistently rather than occasionally. Then develop the decision-making practices, the pre-mortem, the decision journal, the deliberate advice network, the reversibility consequence categorization that allocates deliberation appropriately. Finally, build the leverage structures, the team, the systems, the capital deployment, the distribution channels, the specific leverage forms that multiply whatever effort is applied, The sequence matters because each layer builds on the previous one. Leverage structures built on a foundation of limiting beliefs and the wrong peer group will be undermined by the psychology they're sitting on. Leverage structures built on revised beliefs, a reinforcing peer group, and protected cognitive attention will be supported by the psychology beneath them. Chapter 11. The habits nobody sees. The daily practices that compound into extraordinary outcomes. Here's the chapter that bridges the gap between the psychological portrait painted in the previous 10 chapters and the daily, granular, what actually happens on a Tuesday reality of how high earners live. Because psychology, however well described, remains abstract until it manifests in specific behaviors, in the specific things people do consistently, in the specific things they consistently don't do, and in the specific rhythms and routines that translate internal psychological features into external financial outcomes. The habits of high earners are not the habits that productivity content most enthusiastically promotes. They are not primarily about waking up at 4 a.m., though some high earners do. They are not primarily about journaling, meditation, cold showers, or any of the other practices that have been elevated to near religious status in the self-improvement industry. Some high earners do some of these things, some don't do any of them. The habits that are actually consistent across the high earner population are quieter, less photogenic, and more directly connected to the specific psychological features described in the previous chapters than the popular productivity canon acknowledges. The morning architecture, not what you think. Here's the honest picture of how high earners structure their mornings. Honest because it differs from the dramatized version that productivity content presents, and because the difference matters for people trying to implement something realistic rather than aspirational. The consistent feature across high earners' morning routines is not a specific set of activities. It is the protection of a specific cognitive state, the high-quality, relatively undistracted mental clarity that the morning provides before the day's reactive demands have begun, and the deliberate direction of that state toward the highest leverage thinking the person has to do. For some high earners, this looks like 2 hours of focused writing, strategy work, or deep analysis before checking any communication. For others, it looks like 30 minutes of physical exercise that primes the cognitive state for the work that follows. For others still, it looks like a brief review of the day's highest priority activity and a commitment to protecting the first 2 hours for that activity before anything else is addressed. The specific content varies. The structural principle is consistent. The morning cognitive state is an asset that is protected from the reactive demands, the email, the news, the social media, the other people's requests that will inevitably consume it if it isn't proactively directed first. The financially relevant implication: the person who directs the best cognitive hours of the day toward the highest leverage thinking, the strategy work, the creative problem solving, the complex decisions, and handles reactive and administrative demands in the lower energy afternoon, generates more valuable output from the same total hours than the person who begins the day in reactive mode and attempts the highest leverage work whenever a gap appears. The financial review habit. The practice that most people skip. Here's the habit that has the most direct relationship to financial outcomes, and that the most financially successful people practice with a consistency that their less financially successful peers don't: the regular, systematic review of financial position, not checking the investment account balance during market volatility. That's the opposite of what this habit involves. The financial review habit is a scheduled, calm, comprehensive assessment of net worth, cash flow, savings rate, investment performance against plan, and progress towards specific financial targets, conducted weekly, monthly, or quarterly, depending on the individual's preference, and used as the primary feedback mechanism for adjusting financial behavior. The specific psychological function of this habit is to keep the financial trajectory visible and concrete, rather than allowing it to become the background anxiety that plagues people who know their financial behavior isn't optimal, but who avoid the specific clarity of knowing exactly how far off track they are. The financial review converts the vague discomfort of financial uncertainty into specific, actionable information: the savings rate that is below target, the expense category that has crept above budget, the investment allocation that has drifted from the plan, that can be addressed before small deviations accumulate into large ones. High earners who describe this habit consistently report that it has two distinct benefits beyond the obvious one of staying on top of the numbers. First, it creates a regular scheduled moment of financial intentionality, a time when the financial goal is actively brought to mind and the current trajectory is evaluated against it, which reinforces the wealth optimization orientation that Chapter 3 described. Second, it generates a longitudinal record of financial progress that provides genuine motivational reinforcement during the long middle periods of wealth accumulation when progress feels slow and the goal feels distant. The learning investment, the habit that compounds most mysteriously. Here's the habit that produces the least visible short-term return and the most significant long-term financial impact. The consistent, substantial, daily investment in learning, in the acquisition of knowledge, skills, and frameworks that improve the quality of decisions and the value of professional output. The average American reads approximately 4 books per year. High earners in most studies and surveys report reading 20 to 50 or more books per year. A difference of 5 to 12 times that, sustained over decades, produces a knowledge base that is qualitatively different rather than just quantitatively larger. The financial return on this reading investment is not calculable for any individual book or any specific period. It is the accumulated effect of the frameworks, the case studies, the historical patterns, the domain expertise, and the cognitive models that sustained reading builds, which improve the quality of decisions in ways that are not traceable to specific books but that are visible in the aggregate outcomes those decisions produce. The specific reading strategy that high earners describe most consistently is not reading everything but reading deeply in the domains most relevant to their financial activities, their industry, their investment approach, their business domain, while maintaining a broader reading habit that builds the cross-domain pattern recognition that generates the unexpected connections between fields that characterize the most creative and most financially valuable thinking. Beyond books, the learning investment includes the podcasts and long-form content consumed with active rather than passive attention, the courses and training programs that develop specific high-value skills, the conferences and events that provide concentrated access to domain expertise and emerging trends, and the deliberate cultivation of relationships with people whose expertise fills specific gaps in the investor's or entrepreneur's own knowledge. The compounding nature of the learning investment is the feature that makes it most powerful and most undervalued. Knowledge compounds in the same way that money does, but with a compounding mechanism that is even more reliable, because knowledge, once genuinely acquired, generates returns in every subsequent decision it informs for as long as the knowledge remains relevant. The relationship maintenance ritual, the habit that looks like socializing. Here's the habit that is most frequently mistaken for socializing or networking in the superficial sense, but that is actually one of the most deliberate and most financially consequential practices in the high earner's routine. The consistent, scheduled maintenance of key professional and personal relationships. The specific practice looks different for different people, but shares a common structure, a defined set of relationships that are identified as important. Mentors, peers, potential collaborators, key clients, influential, connections, and a regular cadence of contact with each that is scheduled and maintained rather than left to the organic rhythm of chance encounters and reactive communication. For some high earners, this looks like a weekly coffee or lunch rotation through a defined group of key relationships. For others, it's a monthly email to a broader group with something genuinely useful, an article, a connection, an observation, that provides value to the recipient while maintaining the relationship without requiring the recipient to do anything. For others, it's a quarterly catch-up call list that ensures the most important relationships receive genuine attention on a reliable schedule. The financial return on this habit accumulates through the opportunities, information, and support that maintained relationships generate. The investor who hears about a deal before it's widely known because a maintained relationship thought of them, the entrepreneur whose key hire came through, a relationship that had been consistently cultivated for 3 years, the executive whose promotion was supported by a senior advocate whose relationship had been genuinely invested in over time. None of these returns can be attributed to any single relationship maintenance action. They are the portfolio return of the habit sustained over years, the cumulative output of a relationship infrastructure that most people don't build with sufficient consistency to generate. The reflection practice, the habit that turns experience into wisdom. Here's the final habit, the one that ties all the others together, and that is both the least glamorous and the most intellectually honest of the practices described in this chapter, the regular practice of reflection. Not meditation in the popular sense of clearing the mind. Reflection in the specific sense of directed, honest thinking about what is working and what isn't, what decisions were well made and what weren't, what trajectory is producing and whether it is the trajectory that was intended. High earners who sustain high performance over decades are almost universally people who have built some form of regular reflection practice, whether a Sunday evening review of the week's decisions and outcomes, a quarterly assessment of progress against annual goals, an annual review of the full year's financial, professional, and personal trajectory, or some combination of these. The specific psychological function of reflection is to convert raw experience into genuine learning, to extract the decision-relevant insights from what happened in a way that improves future decisions, rather than allowing experience to pass without the cognitive processing that makes it instructive. Experience without reflection produces repetition. Experience with reflection produces the specific compound learning that separates the person who has 20 years of genuine development from the person who has had the same year 20 times. The reflection practice also serves the identity function described in Chapter 6. It is the regular moment when the internal narrative is updated, when the progress toward goals is acknowledged, when the alignment between values and behavior is honestly assessed, and when the course corrections that maintain direction over time are identified and committed to. It is the least exciting habit on this list, and the one whose compound return over a decade of consistent practice is most difficult to trace to specific outcomes and most clearly visible in the aggregate trajectory. The person who has reflected honestly on their decisions and their direction every week for 10 years is navigating with a quality of self-knowledge and strategic clarity that the person who has been moving through the same decade without pausing to look up simply doesn't have. And in the specific, practical, financial context of this video, in the context of building the psychology, that produces extraordinary wealth outcomes. That self-knowledge and strategic clarity is not a philosophical luxury. It is a genuine competitive advantage, operating quietly, compounding reliably, producing returns that show up not in any single decision, but in the accumulated quality of thousands of decisions made by someone who has consistently taken the time to understand what they are actually doing and why. That is the final habit. That is the practice that holds all the others together. That is, ultimately, what the psychology of people who make a ton of money looks like from the inside. Not a single dramatic quality, not a superhuman trait, not a lucky break that got rationalized into a philosophy, but a collection of specific, learnable, compounding practices sustained with enough consistency that the outcomes they produce begin to look, from the outside, like they must have required something extraordinary. They didn't. They required something ordinary done, extraordinarily consistently, which it turns out is the most extraordinary thing of all. Chapter 12. The one thing they all have in common, the single thread, running through every high earner's story. Here's the chapter that earns its place at the end of this video, not by introducing something new, but by revealing something that has been present in every chapter. A single, consistent, underlying thread that connects the time perception, the risk calibration, the wealth optimization mindset, the attention management, the network psychology, the self-concept, the decision-making architecture, the leverage obsession, the honest acknowledgement of costs, the synthesis framework, and the daily habits into a unified picture that is more instructive than any of its parts individually. Every high earner's story is different. The industries are different. The starting points are different. The specific decisions that produce the outcomes are different. The personalities are different. Some are introverted, some extroverted, some analytical to the point of coldness, some warm and relationally gifted, some who found their domain early and never left it, some who pivoted repeatedly until something clicked. The diversity of the high earner population, when you look at it honestly rather than through the filter of the specific archetype that dominates the popular narrative, is striking. And yet, underneath the diversity of industry, personality, starting point, and strategy, there is one thing, one psychological orientation that appears with such consistency across the full population of people who have built significant wealth on purpose that its absence is more noteworthy than its presence. They took responsibility. Not in the motivational poster sense, not the inspirational claim that you control your destiny and nothing is outside your power. The genuine, specific, psychologically costly version of responsibility, the consistent, deliberate choice to locate the primary determinant of their outcomes in their own decisions, their own effort, their own development, and their own response to circumstances, rather than in the circumstances themselves. What taking responsibility actually means. Here's the specific content of the responsibility orientation that high earners share, because the vague statement that they take responsibility is meaningless without the specific behaviors and cognitive practices it describes. Taking responsibility means that when something goes wrong, and things go wrong for high earners with the same regularity they go wrong for everyone else, the first question asked is not what caused this in the external sense, but what did I contribute to this outcome, and what could I have done differently? The external causes are real and worth understanding, but the internal contribution is where the learning lives, because the external causes are often outside the person's control and the internal contribution is not. This is not self-blame. It is the specific practice of finding the controllable variable in every outcome, the decision that could have been made differently, the information that could have been sought earlier, the system that could have been built to prevent this category of problem, and using that variable as the lever for improvement rather than attributing the outcome entirely to circumstances and moving on without extracting the lesson. The financially relevant consequence of this orientation, the high earner who takes responsibility for a failed business doesn't just rebuild, they rebuild differently, having extracted the specific decision-level learning that the failure contained. The high earner who takes responsibility for an investment loss doesn't just recover the capital. They recover it with a revised investment framework that addresses the specific analytical failure the loss revealed. The learning compounds, because the responsibility orientation ensures that every experience, positive and negative, is mined for its decision-relevant content rather than explained away. The victim narrative and why it's so expensive. Here's the contrast that makes the responsibility orientation's financial value most clear. The specific financial cost of the alternative orientation, the victim narrative, which is more common, more socially reinforced, and more immediately comfortable than the responsibility orientation it displaces. The victim narrative is the consistent attribution of outcomes to external circumstances, the market conditions that weren't favorable, the employer who didn't recognize the value, the economic environment that made success harder, the unfair competition that prevented the business from succeeding, the investors who didn't understand the vision, the timing that was wrong. Each of these attributions may contain genuine truth. Markets are genuinely unfavorable. Sometimes. Employers genuinely do fail to recognize value. Economic environments genuinely do affect outcomes. None of these external attributions are necessarily false. The financial cost is not in the inaccuracy of the external attribution. It is in what the external attribution prevents, the identification of the controllable variable, the extraction of the decision-level learning, and the behavioral change that makes the next attempt more likely to succeed. The person who has explained their business failure entirely through external factors has preserved their ego at the cost of the learning. They will enter the next business with the same decision patterns that contributed to the first failure because those patterns were never identified as contributors. High earners who have built significant wealth through multiple attempts, who have experienced failure and rebuilt, are almost universally people who extracted the internal learning from those failures rather than explaining them entirely externally. Not because they blame themselves for everything, but because they understand that the external factors are not where their leverage lives. Their leverage is in their decisions, their systems, their development, and their response. And finding that leverage requires the willingness to look honestly at their own contribution to every outcome. The responsibility orientation as a practice. Here's the specific psychological challenge of the responsibility orientation that makes it a practice rather than a disposition, something that requires ongoing cultivation rather than a one-time decision. The natural human tendency towards self-serving attribution is powerful, persistent, and socially reinforced. The self-serving attribution bias, the documented tendency to attribute successes to internal factors and failures to external ones, is one of the most robust findings in social psychology. It operates automatically, it is motivated by the genuine psychological need to maintain self-esteem, and it is reinforced by the social environment, because attributing your successes to yourself and your failures to circumstances is socially comfortable for everyone involved. Your friends don't argue with it. Your family doesn't challenge it. The social equilibrium supports it. The responsibility orientation requires overriding this automatic socially supported bias consistently in both directions, taking genuine responsibility for failures and being honest about the internal contributors, and taking genuine responsibility for successes by understanding specifically what decisions and efforts produce them, which is the knowledge that allows the success to be replicated rather than attributed to luck and therefore unavailable for reproduction. The practice of overriding the self-serving attribution bias is genuinely psychologically costly in the short term. Identifying your own contribution to a bad outcome feels worse than explaining the outcome through external factors. Maintaining the discipline to ask, "What did I do to contribute to this?" when the easier answer is, "This happened to me," requires a level of psychological honesty that most people apply inconsistently, and that high earners apply with unusual consistency. The reason they apply it consistently is not masochism or an unusual tolerance for self-criticism. It is the specific understanding, absorbed through experience, through mentorship, through the decision journal that tracks the relationship between decisions and outcomes, that the short-term psychological cost of honest self-assessment is far smaller than the long-term financial cost of the alternative. The painful, honest assessment that produces behavioral change is an investment. The comfortable external attribution that produces no change is an expense. The compound return of consistent responsibility. Here's the financial framing that makes the responsibility orientation's value most concrete. It generates the highest compound return of any psychological practice described in this video because it is the practice that converts every experience, every success, every failure, every decision, every outcome into an input that improves future decisions. Consider two people with identical starting points, identical opportunities, and identical initial capabilities. Person A attributes successes to their skills and failures to circumstances. Person B attributes both to their decisions and their development, finding the internal contributor in every outcome and using it to improve future decisions. After 10 years of experiences, including the full range of successes, failures, near misses, and surprises that 10 years of genuine effort in any domain produces, Person B has extracted learning from every one of those experiences in a way that Person A hasn't. Person B's decision quality has compounded in a way that Person A's hasn't. The financial outcomes of the two people starting from identical positions will be significantly different at year 10, not because Person B was smarter or luckier, but because they converted their experiences into learning at a rate that Person A's attribution pattern prevented. The responsibility orientation is, in this framing, the psychological practice that most directly produces the compound learning that drives the compound financial outcomes. Why this is the one thing. Here's the final synthesis. Why responsibility, among all the psychological features described in this video, deserves to be called the single thread that connects them all. The vivid relationship with the future self is only possible when you've accepted responsibility for the future self's outcomes. When you've accepted that what happens to that person is substantially determined by what you decide and do now, rather than by circumstances outside your control, the accurate risk calibration is only possible when you're willing to assess your own analytical errors honestly, rather than attributing mispriced risks to unpredictable markets. The wealth optimization mindset requires taking responsibility for the consumption choices that income optimization has normalized, accepting that the pattern is your choice, rather than a requirement of your social environment. The attention management requires accepting responsibility for where your attention goes, rather than experiencing it as something that circumstances direct. The self-concept expansion requires accepting responsibility for the limiting beliefs you currently hold and the decision to revise them. In every case, The psychological feature is built on the foundation of responsibility, on the consistent orientation toward the self as the primary agent in one's financial life, whose decisions, development, and responses are the primary determinants of outcomes. Every chapter in this video describes a feature of the high earner psychology that is only fully accessible to the person who has genuinely internalized this orientation. And here's the most honest and most important thing this video can say as it closes. The responsibility orientation is available to everyone. It is not a personality trait distributed randomly at birth. It is not a product of a specific upbringing or a specific set of formative experiences, though those things influence it. It is a choice, a specific, renewable daily choice to locate the primary variable in your financial and professional outcomes inside your own agency rather than outside it. It is a choice that high earners make more consistently than average. It is a choice that produces the specific compound learning that drives the specific compound financial outcomes that make their stories worth studying. And it is a choice that is available right now in this specific moment to every person who has watched this entire video and is deciding what to do with it. The psychology of people who make a ton of money is, at its deepest level, the psychology of people who decided that their outcomes were primarily their responsibility and then did the long, unglamorous, profoundly ordinary work of living up to that decision every day. That's it. That's the whole thing. The only question left is what you decide. Conclusion. Let's land this. You came to this video with a question embedded in the title. What is the psychology of people who make a ton of money? The implicit sub-question, the one that most people are actually asking when they engage with content about high earner psychology, is, what is different about them, and can I develop those differences? The answer to both parts of that question has been the substance of this video, and here's the synthesis. What's different about high earners is not primarily what popular culture suggests. It's not that they're smarter, though many are sharp. It's not that they're more ruthless, though some are tough. It's not that they work harder in the simple hours per day sense, though many work intensely. It's not that they got luckier, though luck has played a role for many of them. What's actually different is a specific configuration of psychological features that produce different decisions across the full range of choices that accumulate into a financial life. They experience time differently, with a vivid, emotionally real relationship with their future selves that makes the deferred gratification of wealth accumulation feel like genuine self-care rather than deprivation. They assess risk more accurately, not fearlessly, but with better calibration between the actual probability of outcomes and the emotional weight those outcomes carry in decision-making. They have crossed the specific psychological line from income optimization to wealth optimization, from caring primarily about the flow of money to caring primarily about the stock of assets and the passive income it generates. They manage their attention as a finite and precious resource, protecting it from the fragmentation that the modern environment systematically produces, directing it toward the activities that generate the highest return, and building the information diet that maintains the cognitive quality that high-leverage decisions require. They build and maintain relationships through a value creation orientation that generates the kind of deep, durable professional network that creates compounding opportunities over decades. They have developed a self-concept, a growth identity, an internal locus of control, an expansive sense of what is available to them that doesn't cap their financial potential below what the market would otherwise reward. And they have built the decision-making architecture, the leverage structures, and the energy management practices that multiply whatever effort they apply into more output than the same effort would produce without those systems. Can these features be developed? Yes. Not instantly, not painlessly, not through the consumption of content alone, including this content. The development requires the specific work of examining and revising beliefs, designing environments that reinforce the target psychology, building the habits and systems that make the desired behaviors automatic, and sustaining the effort through the discomfort that genuine psychological change always involves. But here's the honest final assessment that this video has been building toward from the first sentence. The gap between the psychology that produces ordinary financial outcomes and the psychology that produces extraordinary ones is not a gap in innate talent or fortunate circumstance. It is a gap in specific, learnable, developable psychological features that have been described in enough detail across these 10 chapters that anyone willing to do the actual work of development has a genuine map of what that work involves. The map is not the territory. Reading about the psychology of high earners is not the same as developing it. But the map, honestly drawn, is where every journey starts. The territory is yours to explore. Go build something extraordinary.